This is Damon Fordham, Professor of History at Virginia College in Charleston, South Carolina, and I'm about to tell you of a little-known event in history known as the Stono Rebellion. The Stono Rebellion took place almost exactly 275 years to the day that I am doing this. It took place on September the 9th, 1793. At the time, the number of African slaves in South Carolina were roughly 66% of the population. And it was understood that this population could really represent a serious danger to the larger population if they ever tried to rebel. Around the same time, Florida was a Spanish territory, and it offered freedom for any black people who would come down there into their territory. They would be welcomed basically and set free. So there was a lot of talk among African slaves in the area of escaping to Florida. On September the 9th, 1793, on a place called Stono Ferry, which is presently near what we now know as Ravenel, South Carolina. If you go across the Stono Bridge on 17th South, you'll see a motel which used to be known as Peter Miller's, and across from that was what was once known as Hutchinson's Store. And on that date, a group of African slaves led by two men by the name of Jimmy and Cato, they burst into the store, stole weapons and axes, killed the store owners, and went on a rampage heading south toward Florida, killing people on the plantations and setting fires and so forth as they went along. And they gathered a huge army of black people who were fighting their way to Florida to be free. Well, in the midst of this, Lieutenant Governor William Bull was on his way through a hunting expedition when he heard about what happened. So what happened next? Well, roughly 200 years after this, a man by the name of Stiles Suggs up in Columbia, South Carolina, he interviewed a black man by the name of George Cato. George Cato was the great descendant of the same Cato who led the Stono Rebellion. And we're kind of lucky that he interviewed him, because there was a long family history that was passed down through the generations that George Cato had heard from his great-great-grandparents. This is what he said happened on that day that the history books missed out on. He said that Stiles Suggs said that he interviewed George Cato, a Negro laborer residing at the rear of 1010 Lady Street in Columbia, South Carolina. He was the great-great-grandson of the late Cato slave who commanded the Stono insurrection in 1739, in which 21 white people and 44 Negroes were slain. Cato, who was 50 years at the time, says that this Negro uprising has been a tradition in his family for 198 years. And yes, he spoke very highly of how he managed to escape and get these people together. He went on to say that his great-great-grandparents, he said, was basically, he was pretty well treated as far as slaves were concerned. That he also knew how to read and write, but he was not one to take the idea of slavery lying down. He said that he took about 100 slaves between the Cohambie and Edisto rivers, and after that they marched in Stono Town, and they worked fast for 15 miles, passing many fine plantations, and every single one stopped and broke in the house and killed men, women, and children. Then they'd take what they wanted, including arms, clothes, liquor, and food. Near the Cohambie Swamp, Lieutenant Governor William Bull, driving from Beaufort to Charleston, saw them, and he smelled a rat. Before he was seen by the army, he detoured in the big woods and stayed till the rebels passed. Governor Bull and some planters between the Cohambie and Edisto rode fast and spread the alarm, and it wasn't long before the militiamen were on the trail in pursuit of the slave army. When they were found, many of the slaves were singing and dancing, and Captain Cato and some of the other leaders were cursing at them something awful. He goes on to say that basically they had been drinking and celebrating, and he said ever since that day, no Cato descendant would ever take a drop of liquor because of what happened. And it was because of that that this led to a shootout in which 44 black people were slain. He said that his grandfather said that in the woods and around Stono where the war started, there were more than 100 Negroes in line. And when the militia came inside of them in the Cohambie Swamp, the drinking and dancing Negroes scattered in the bush, and 44 stood their ground. He said, Cato spoke to the crowd and said, "We don't like slavery. We're starting to join the Spanish in Florida. We surrender, but we're not whipped yet, and we are not converted." And the other 43 said, "Amen." They were taken unarmed and hanged by the militia. Long before the uprising, the Cato slave wrote passes for slaves and did all he could to send them for freedom. He died, but he died for doing the right as he saw it. Now, the important thing about the story is that many people, they say they don't want to hear about slavery and so forth, but the fact of the matter is, there were a lot of people during slavery who didn't stand for what was going on and fought against that system and should be remembered for fighting against that system. Anyway, if you want to learn more about that story, I wrote about it in my book, True Stories of Black South Carolina, which can be found on Amazon.com or the History Press's website. This is Damon Fordham talking about the Stono Rebellion of September the 9th, 1739.